This is Oath, Director's Ed, Episode 7, Slave Education. Did you know that slaves were actively and brutally denied an education? You see, since the inception of slavery in the U.S., slaves were denied the right to an education, whether it be from others or of, by, and for oneself. An important question is, why was that? In the general sense of things, slave owners felt that education was antithetical to the flourishing of the slave industry. Yes, it was an industry. A Negro who could read was a Negro who could reason. A Negro who could read was a Negro who could organize. A Negro who could read was a Negro who could influence. A Negro who could read was a Negro who could teach. And all of that was a threat to the white slave owners. Why? Think of it like this. Because the, quote, dumber, unquote, a black man or woman was, the more controllable they were, the more malleable they were to the slave owners' wants, needs, and desires. But ultimately, if slaves were kept in the dark, it would be much harder for them to rebel. So how did the antebellum South enforce such draconian measures to ensure that blacks would stay, quote-unquote, ignorant? Laws. For example, this law in 1831 passed by the General Assembly of the State of Northern Carolina that states, quote, an act to prevent all persons from teaching slaves to read or write, the use of figures excepted. Whereas the teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion to the manifest injury of citizens of this state. Therefore, be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of North Carolina, and it is hereby enacted by the authority of the same, that any free person who shall hereafter teach or attempt to teach any slave within the state to read or write, the use of figures excepted, or shall give or sell to such slave or slaves any books or pamphlets, shall be liable to indictment in any court of record in this state having jurisdiction thereof, and upon conviction shall at the discretion of the court, if a white man or woman be fined not less than $100 nor more than $200 or imprisoned. And if a free person of color shall be fined, imprisoned, or whipped at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 39 lashes, nor less than 20 lashes. Section 2. Be it further enacted that if any slave shall hereafter teach or attempt to teach any other slave to read or write, the use of figures excepted, he or she may be carried before any justice of the peace, and on conviction thereof, shall be sentenced to receive 39 lashes on his or her bare back. Did you notice the discrepancies in the punishments? Aside from the previously mentioned reasons for the prohibition of educating slaves, many whites did not feel that blacks had the capacity to learn and therefore did not want to spend resources on educating them. Some slave masters were afraid that literate slaves would figure out how to forge pass papers, which would allow them, of course, to move freely within an area. And some slave owners were afraid of slaves reading abolitionist papers that might inspire them to revolt by discovering a white audience that was in favor of the abolishment of slavery. Now, it was not the absolute rule that blacks should not learn to read or write. For example, there were plantations that were managed by proxy in which the slave owner hired out management of the property and slaves to others. And it was sometimes good for the slaves to be able to read and write for activities such as ordering supplies, managing books, or keeping the owner apprised of the plantation affairs. In other instances, plantation owners would teach their slaves through the use of the Bible, but there generally was a more nefarious reason for doing so. You see, the Bible was heavily redacted or edited down in a way that would emphasize servitude, submission, and the righteousness of the slave condition. This indoctrination, of course, was a method of suppression, oppression, and with the added benefit of teaching self-devaluing methods so that the slave would have a perpetual tape that constantly reminded them of their, quote, inferiority, unquote, to their captors. Yet despite all of this, Black people during the entire period of slavery craved education. And because one of the only forums in which Blacks were allowed to gather in numbers without the fear of the whip was the church, that was one of the places where they could try and educate themselves. Pre-emancipation proclamation, there were many instances of Blacks establishing rudimentary schools for their kind, and some of the earliest were called pit schools, and were called that because they were essentially pits dug out in the grounds, in the woods, away from the homes of the masters, where hopefully they wouldn't get caught teaching. Post-emancipation, there were ample examples of freed slaves establishing educational institutions. These institutions were primarily funded by the donations of white patrons, and as you can guess, were notoriously underfunded. Yet and still, they were often targets of violent actions or arson. Othello was obviously an educated man who spoke eloquently despite his protestations to the contrary. But his level of education would have been an exception rather than the rule in this time period. He would have been, quote, the privileged, unquote, one. What would later be defined by the concept called the talented tenth by W.E. Du Bois, which further complicates the problem of what I will discuss called the monolithic Negro in another video.